The tectonic plates of Caribbean power fractured irrevocably on January 29, 2026, when Executive Order 14,380 effectively nullified 60 years of static embargo in favor of total interdiction. By early February, the geopolitical equilibrium that had allowed the Republic of Cuba to survive as an ideological outlier vanished. The strategic pivot followed the January extraction of the Venezuelan leadership, a move that severed Havana's primary energy artery and left the island's infrastructure in a state of terminal decay. Washington's declaration of a national emergency transformed the Florida Strait from a monitored waterway into a high-density kill zone for any sovereign vessel attempting to breach the energy blockade. The abrogation of the 1994 and 1995 migration accords signaled the end of diplomacy, as U.S. Southern Command, SOUTHCOM, shifted its weight from passive containment to active kinetic posture. The Monroe Doctrine was reasserted with 21st century brutality. Regional powers, including Mexico, were forced into compliance through the threat of crippling ad valorem tariffs, leaving Cuba isolated without a secondary supplier or a diplomatic shield. The state of total national emergency, declared by the Communist Party of Cuba on February 6th, marked the transition from economic crisis to state collapse imminent. By mid-February, the Caribbean basin became a theater of neo-imperial liquidation. The United States leveraged the collapse of the Cuban power grid, operating at less than 22% capacity, to justify a preemptive stability operation. This was no longer a dispute over sugar or ideology. It was a systematic erasure of a hostile actor from the Western Hemisphere. The deployment of U.S. Marine Expeditionary Forces to the periphery of Cuban territorial waters represented the final phase of a strategy designed to achieve total regime liquidation. The silence from the international community, paralyzed by the speed of the American escalation and the threat of trade exclusion, confirmed a new global reality. The Caribbean was once again an American lake, and the cost of defiance was total structural annihilation. The initial contact at Mariel Beachhead was a collision of raw kinetic energy. The 2nd Marine Division's vanguard hit the shoreline at 0500 hours, meeting the entrenched positions of the Cuban 71st Mechanized Brigade. This was not a tactical withdrawal, but a brutal, a close-quarters grinding of organic matter against steel. Infantry squads from the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, breached the first line of trenches under a deluge of small arms fire that saturated the salt air. The sound of high-cadence rifle fire suppressed the natural roar of the Atlantic as the Marines pushed through waist-deep water into a nightmare of barbed wire and reinforced concrete bunkers. On the Cuban side, the defense was built on a fanatical adherence to war of all the people. Every 50 meters of coastline was a designated kill box. Cuban infantry, utilizing antiquated but lethal bolt action and semi-automatic rifles, alongside modernized Kalashnikovs, held their ground until they were physically overrun. The 71st Mechanized Brigade's infantrymen fought from subterranean spider holes by popping up to fire into the flanks of the advancing Marine platoons. The density of lead in the air was so thick that the visual field was a constant blur of tracer rounds and ricochets off the limestone cliffs. By 0700 hours, the engagement escalated into a series of isolated, vicious duels within the destroyed coastal villas. Marine fire teams utilized stack and clear tactics, moving through breached walls with clinical precision, while Cuban defenders utilized the rubble for makeshift barricades. Bayonets were fixed as the proximity of the combatants closed to within 10 meters. The Cuban infantry utilized the dense, urban fringe vegetation to launch desperate counterattacks, attempting to split the Marine landing force before they could establish a cohesive perimeter. The casualties on both sides mounted with mechanical regularity. Every room cleared was paid for in blood. The central sector of the beachhead became a stagnant pool of violence. A Cuban battalion-strength countercharge, intended to drive the 2nd Marines back into the surf, met a wall of concentrated suppression. The dirt turned into a crimson slurry as bodies piled in the drainage ditches along the coastal highway. There was no maneuvering for advantage, only the relentless application of frontal pressure. The Marines utilized their superior fire discipline to methodically dismantle the Cuban defensive nests, one bunker at a time, using grenades and raw physical aggression. By the end of the first 3 hours of ground contact, the 71st Mechanized Brigade had lost 40% of its effective fighting strength. The Marines, though advancing, were forced to navigate a landscape littered with the remnants of the first wave. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt propellant and the iron tang of massive trauma. This was the reality of the infantry clash, a primitive struggle for inches of soil, defined by the endurance of the individual soldier and the terrifying lethality of the modern rifle squad. The tactical pause at the coast evaporated as the U.S. 2nd Marine Division transitioned from amphibious landing to a full-spectrum divisional assault. The objective, the high ground of the Artemisa Ridge, the gateway to Havana. This was no longer a battle of squads. It was a symphony of heavy-caliber destruction. 155mm M777 howitzers, established on the secured beaches, began a relentless rhythm of fire. Each shell was a physical hammer blow against the Cuban 4th Armored Division's defensive crust. The earth at the base of the ridge did not just shake, it liquefied under the weight of high explosives. The Cuban response was a desperate, scorched earth fire plan. Hidden T-62M and T-55 tanks, buried to their turrets in reinforced hull-down positions, opened fire with 115mm and 100mm cannons. They turned the transit corridors into corridors of fire. Every armored vehicle that dared to crest the initial slopes was met with a concentrated volley of anti-tank guided missiles and kinetic energy penetrators. The Cuban 4th Division utilized the pre-sighted kill zones in the valley, creating a horizontal storm of steel that stalled the American advance for 6 grueling hours. The escalation reached a fever pitch as the U.S. and 1st Marine Aircraft Wing began its low-level interdiction. While technically avoiding mechanized mechanisms, the impact was felt through the erasure of entire Cuban grid squares. The skyline of Artemisa was replaced by a permanent wall of black smoke and the orange flicker of secondary explosions. The Cuban artillery, consisting of D-30 towed howitzers and BM-21 rocket launchers, fired until their barrels warped from heat. They rained thousands of fragmentation rounds onto the American assembly areas, turning the pristine Cuban farmland into a jagged landscape of craters and shrapnel. At the center of this firestorm was the battle for Hill 212, a strategic overlook. The peak changed hands 3 times in 4 hours. Each transition was preceded by a divisional-level fire mission that stripped the hill of all vegetation and topsoil. Now, when the Marines finally secured the summit, they were standing on a mound of pulverized rock and spent shell casings. The Cuban 4th Division, refusing to yield the strategic height, launched a final, suicidal armored thrust. The clash of steel was heard miles away, a grinding, screeching end for the Cuban armor as they were methodically dismantled by the heavier, more precise American fire. By dusk, the thermal signature of the Artemisa Ridge was visible from orbit. The escalation of firepower had reached a point where the environment itself was unrecognizable. The air was a toxic mix of cordite, ozone, and the scent of vaporized lubricants. The Cuban 4th Armored Division had ceased to exist as a functional maneuver element, its remains scattered across the valley in a series of burning pyres. The Marines had won the ridge, but the cost was a localized ecological catastrophe, a testament to the devastating lethality of divisional-scale kinetic escalation. the localized breakthroughs fractured into a synchronized, island-wide geometry of annihilation. By the fourth dawn, the invasion ceased to be a linear progression and mutated into an industrial-scale consumption of human life across 5 simultaneous fronts. From the urban corridors of Matanzas to the heavily fortified approaches of Santa Clara and the eastern choke points outside Guantanamo, the theater of operations became a series of interconnected meat grinders. The metric of success devolved from territory, gained to the sheer, mathematical volume of enemy formations erased from the operational map. It was a conveyor belt of destruction, and on where thousands of infantrymen and hundreds of armored chassis were fed into the friction zones daily, yielding nothing but altered casualty statistics. In the Central Plains, the clash between the 1st Marine Division and the Cuban Central Army evolved into a relentless, mechanized slaughterhouse. The concept of a front line dissolved into a chaotic mosaic of overlapping kill boxes spanning 200 square miles. U.S. armored spearheads drove deep into the defensive belts, creating massive salients that the Cuban forces immediately counterattacked with fanatical mass infantry waves. The resulting collisions were devoid of tactical finesse. They were pure, blunt force trauma applied on a macroscopic scale. Brigades on both sides were rendered combat ineffective within 72 hours of deployment, when their remnants absorbed into ad hoc formations, only to be fed back into the identical grid squares the following morning. The Eastern Theater mirrored this industrial lethality. Around the perimeter of the U.S. naval base, the Cuban Eastern Army attempted a mass saturation offensive to crush the breakout. The Marine perimeter defenses operated like an automated scythe, processing the advancing columns through interlocking arcs of heavy machine gun and automatic grenade fire. The terrain became a dumping ground for shattered steel and mangled chassis, piled so densely that maneuverability became impossible. The combatants were locked in a stagnant, high-volume exchange of high explosives and small arms, expending ammunition at rates that defied standard military planning. The slaughter was continuous, a 24-hour cycle of kinetic expenditure that turned vibrant valleys into lunar expanses of cratered Earth. This phase of the campaign was defined by its terrifying anonymity. At the strategic command centers, the loss of a battalion was no longer a tragedy, but a slight adjustment in the daily expenditure charts. The horrific reality of the meat grinder was that the sheer scale of the carnage numbed the strategic calculus. 10,000 casualties a day became the acceptable baseline for operations. The island was systematically partitioned into designated zones of eradication, where the only objective was to maximize the application of lethal force until the adversary's demographic capacity to resist simply ceased to exist. It was a war of absolute attrition, stripping away all military doctrine until only the raw, the brutal arithmetic of mutual destruction remained. The conflict metastasized into an apocalyptic convergence of entire field armies. This was the zenith of the campaign, a synchronized multi-front collision where the United States Marine Corps Expeditionary Forces and the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces committed their final undivided strength into a shared crucible. The operational map shattered into distinct theaters of absolute massacre. In the shadow of the Escambre Mountains and along the coastal highways of Holguin, massive columns of infantry and armor engaged in apocalyptic death matches. This was no longer about tactical maneuvering or territorial acquisition. It was a pure test of collective endurance and terminal resolve. The Marines advanced with an unrelenting, grim determination, operating under a collective mandate to eradicate all organized resistance regardless of the human toll. They moved as a monolithic force, a tidal wave of disciplined lethality sweeping across the island's midsection. Entire regiments marched into sustained crossfires, absorbing horrific losses without breaking stride or altering their vector. The American infantrymen fought with a terrifying, silent ferocity, treating their own staggering casualty rates as a mere operational tax. When forward units were obliterated, secondary waves immediately stepped over the fallen to maintain the momentum of the assault, bound by an unwavering commitment to total victory. Standing against this juggernaut, the Cuban defense transformed into a magnificent, tragic display of absolute defiance. Depleted divisions, reduced to fractions of their original strength, refused to capitulate or retreat under any circumstances. Cuban soldiers, facing overwhelming kinetic superiority, chained themselves to heavy machine guns and anti-aircraft emplacements to ensure they could not abandon their defensive posts. Entire battalions chose deliberate annihilation over surrender, launching catastrophic frontal counteroffensives directly into the teeth of the American armor. They fought with a fatalistic fanaticism, utilizing point-blank anti-tank rockets and satchel charges in suicidal bids to halt the mechanized advance. In the provincial capitals, the clashes devolved into savage, quarter-by-quarter exterminations. Army-level assets on both sides were expended without hesitation to secure single intersections. The architectural heritage of the nation was leveled to create barricades, behind which defenders fought until their ammunition was completely exhausted, and then fought with entrenching tools and bare hands. The American forces matched this fanaticism with overwhelming, concentrated barrage tactics, leveling entire city blocks rather than yielding a single step of forward progress. This was a war of extinction, waged by men who had accepted their own mortality the moment the orders were issued. The battlefield became a monument to mutual destruction, a landscape where the sheer willpower of the combatants eclipsed the hardware they wielded. The collision of these two unyielding forces resulted in an unprecedented harvest of the dead, a catastrophic squandering of human potential in the name of absolute military supremacy. The climax of the campaign was written in the blood of tens of thousands, a testament to the tragic, terrifying capacity of organized armies to choose mutual annihilation over concession. There was no glory left, only the cold certainty of mutual slaughter and the permanent silence that would surely follow. The terminal phase of the campaign manifested not as a conventional military defeat, but as a state-mandated demographic liquidation. The United States Marine Corps Expeditionary Forces executed a simultaneous, island-wide surge, transitioning from maneuver warfare to a grid-by-grid sanitization protocol. Across the burning remains of the operational map, from the western peninsulas to the eastern naval perimeters, the American military apparatus applied its absolute maximum kinetic potential. There was no longer a front line, only a continuous, mechanized wave of finality designed to permanently extinguish the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces. Deep inside subterranean complexes, shielded from the immediate consequences of their directives, the Cuban High Command cemented their fatal legacy. Driven by an ideological ambition utterly divorced from the tactical reality above, the ruling class issued their ultimate mandate: total mobilization without the option of retreat. This order effectively transformed their remaining military infrastructure into a massive suicide pact. The generals demanded that every conscript, militiaman, and broken infantry remnant throw themselves against the advancing American armored juggernaut. It was a calculated sacrifice of an entire generation to preserve the illusion of governmental continuity. And the execution of these final orders resulted in unquantifiable slaughter. The Cuban forces, stripped of heavy armor and coherent command structures, advanced in disorganized human waves into the teeth of interlocking American fire corridors. The Marine heavy brigades did not even need to advance. They simply anchored their treads and processed the incoming masses with heavy machine guns and automatic grenade launchers. The disparity in lethality was absolute. Cuban battalions ceased to exist within minutes of entering the engagement zones. The attackers were not fighting a battle. They were marching into an industrial shredder built of depleted uranium and high explosives. Entire transit routes became choked with the physical remains of the regime's ambition. The systemic collapse of the Cuban military was defined by its terrifying obedience. Field officers, paralyzed by the fear of internal execution, marched their depleted units directly into pre-registered artillery impact grids. The American artillery units operated continuously, treating the massed infantry targets as simple mathematical variables to be zeroed out. There was no martial glory in this final exchange, only the grim, mechanical eradication of a human force acting under the delusion of their superiors. By the 48th hour of the final surge, the Cuban army experienced total structural death. The ruling elite had gambled their entire military apparatus on a strategy of terminal endurance and lost absolutely. The unquantifiable casualties were a direct testament to the catastrophic arrogance of the political leadership. The United States military expeditionary forces stood entirely uncontested amidst the vast, smoking ruins of a sovereign nation's completely erased defensive capability. The ambition of the state had consumed its own protectors, leaving behind a silent, ruined landmass where an army had once stood. The conflict ended not through diplomatic surrender, but through the pure, undeniable reality that there was simply no organic matter left to feed into the completely extinguished fires of armed resistance across the broken land.